And I want to say, first of all, that the history of the series, the series is named Hidden Histories and Silenced Lives. And the podcast is one of the first pieces that we built the other lectures around. So thank you for being like a solid anchoring piece for our series of lectures. So thank you. I'm glad you're with us.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be joining you.
Yeah, greatly. So I'm just going to introduce our speaker today. Madeleine Baran is going to be speaking about the podcast In the Dark that was about the uncovering the events and subsequences and realities and disappointments, perhaps, of the Haditha massacre in Iraq. And Madeleine Baran, our guest today, is the investigative reporter. She's the host and lead reporter of In the Dark, an investigative podcast produced at The New Yorker. In the Dark's reporting on notorious war crimes in Iraq forced the U.S. military to release thousands of records, including photos of the killings and records of hundreds of other alleged war crimes. Baran's previous reporting helped lead the Supreme Court to overturn the conviction of a Black man on death row in Mississippi. Her work has exposed racial discrimination by prosecutors, a decades-long cover-up of clergy sexual abuse in the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis, and unchecked violence in mental health institutions. Baran has received the Alfred A. DuPont Columbia Award, the George Polk Award, the George Foster Peabody Award, and the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award. Robert F. Kennedy Sr., not Junior. We're really delighted you're with us. You've done important work on many, many fronts. And in this case, it's in an area of our interest, the Middle East. We sometimes when you talk about these regional studies areas, you think about the people and the politics within, but the work actually brings to mind the fact that this region has been colonized really for more than almost 2 centuries, if you will, of all the involvement. And the US involvement of the last 30 years has been one of the most horrific experiences in the region and for many other parts of the world. So thank you again for enriching this discussion on the MENA region. And it's a very important conversation in terms of what will happen with military events and massacres and investigations and freedom of the press. We have so many things to discuss with you, but welcome. And I guess I'll begin with just a basic question. Given that your investigation has been on largely domestic investigations or events, and what took you towards Haditha and Iraq and the Middle East in general?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a good question. So basically the reason that we ended up reporting this story is that I have been interested. I mean, I've done a lot of reporting on the criminal justice system in the United States, the regular part of the criminal justice system, but I've always been interested in this other part that is even less understood, which is how war crimes are prosecuted in the United States. And I feel like, war crimes and alleged war crimes, these are things that every time that there is a conflict, you start to hear in the news, that's an allegation of a war crime. Will the Hague take it up? What will the ICC do? But it seemed like in a lot of the coverage and also in just in our own collective understanding, we just don't know that much about really what happens to an allegation of a war crime. Like even the most basic questions, I think many of us would fail like a 15-question quiz on it. It's just like that poorly understood. And I think that, that is particularly interesting when you consider that these types of crimes are among the most egregious crimes, arguably, that could be committed. Crimes that are committed by a government employee acting on government time in the middle of a war. and raises like the ultimate questions of accountability. And so I was interested in this system, this poorly understood system, which in the United States is managed entirely within the U.S. military itself. So the U.S. military has its own system for prosecuting war criminals or alleged war criminals. And then when on our team, on the In the Dark teams, I work on a great team of 5 reporters and producers plus editors. And we were thinking about different potential stories to pursue. And what stood out to us right away, of course, about Haditha is that in the Haditha killings, you had something that you don't always have in these types of incidents, where the US military was acknowledging, people within the US military were, from an official position, acknowledging that something happened here that was worthy of an investigation, that was worthy of a prosecution. And yet nobody served a day behind bars for the killings. And so it seemed like a particularly good example to look at, because this was the one incident in the Iraq War where, when the killings were exposed, everybody, I mean, President George W. Bush on down, said, we're going to take this seriously. There's going to be an investigation. We're going to get to the bottom of this. The public will know what really happened in Haditha. And of course, basically none of that ended up being true. But by that point, everybody had moved on, or at least everybody in maybe in the United States had moved on from the story. And so it seemed like one of those stories that had just sort of slipped through the cracks, and had somehow attracted a lot of attention at the time. Seemed like it was going to tell us something really important, and then we just never really heard much about it ever again. So that's kind of how we began the reporting. Yeah.
So just to put that in context, because Abu Ghraib is like a shadow that's kind of looming over this the Hadith. So and I'm just trying to get the timing. So what did the Abu Ghraib situation force the President Bush to say we'll address this, or did Abu Ghraib was discovered after Hadith? Because however, whether one or after, Abu Ghraib did cast a shadow in some cases.
Sure. I mean, Abu Ghraib obviously is like the most well-known of the alleged war crimes that happens in Iraq, arguably. I think what's different about Abu Ghraib is that it belongs to, like, the questions that Abu Ghraib raises are arguably slightly different questions in some cases. There's a lot of overlap, of course. But I think that, Haditha was, well, and Abu Ghraib were both raising questions about like human questions about, like, why would service members do these things? With Abu Ghraib, they got way more attention. With Haditha, even though in Haditha you had, 20 some odd dead civilians, it never quite got the same attention as Abu Ghraib. And like, I think that's understandable, because with Abu Ghraib, of course, what is different? You have these really striking photos right from the beginning. And that makes the story really undeniable. With Haditha, there were some images that were released, but the majority of the photos were not seen at the time.
Yeah, just my sense is that because Abu Ghraib was such a smear on the U.S. military, that the U.S. government tried to, step ahead of the situation and say, well, we'll figure it out and we'll sort it out and so on. But of course, there's always I think in politics, and we're seeing this sort of in Gaza, is that you can sort of talk things up a certain way and then people will lose interest. So maybe they were relying on that. And of course, as you were saying, the photos are very important in that. That's why General Hagee was saying,
right,
if the photos are not there, nobody will talk about it. And they were counting on hiding the photos as a way of killing the story as well.
Right. I was just going to mention exactly that. So one of the things that we found when we went to the Marine Corps archives at Quantico was that there existed within the Marine Corps archives an interview that had been done, an oral history, with the man who was in charge of the Marine Corps, the Commandant Michael Hagee at the time. And he was reflecting, who was the Commandant at the time of the Haditha incident. And he was reflecting back sometime later about that incident, and specifically and directly talking about how proud he was that that did not become another Abu Ghraib. And he was talking about the role of the photos, that this thing that was different about Abu Ghraib, like it's not just my opinion that the thing that was different about Abu Ghraib, it's also the opinion of the then head of the Marine Corps, that the thing that was different about Haditha versus Abu Ghraib was that in Haditha, the press never got the pictures. And, you know, and they're sort of almost like joking about it a little bit, like they're laughing, the interviewer and Hagee, a little bit about this fact, because the photos are powerful. And you know, that was the first, I mean, I read that transcript before I had the photos, but that was a clue about why these photos were so important to try to get, that there was something in these photos that the commandant of the Marine Corps thought was so potentially problematic for the reputation of the Marine Corps that he was, you know, relieved and proud that those had never been made public.
Well, in that interview, because I listened to it again, and I really wanted to have the wording of the historian Allison, I think is Mark Allison.
Yes, Fred
And
Allison.
he was just sort of, can you tell us about the Haditha thing? He said, and it was a very striking expression of saying that it's a thing. It's not a massacre. It's not even an incident. It's not a trial. And that's even after all the legal stuff has happened. And so that kind of, for me, it was, and of course the jokiness and the pride that the general had felt about hiding the photos and not releasing them, that sort of got me into a sense of maybe the psychology behind all of this, that in fact, from top down, really, that's just a thing. It's not a serious thing. It's something for the public to deal with. Just really, it was sort of bespoke the level of dehumanization that really, even in retrospect, that this is not an issue that the government is willing to deal with seriously. So just, I wonder if that was, I don't know when you came to the interview, but I wonder if the interview sort of let you into the psychology that was behind the efforts of hiding and not telling, or really the level of dehumanization that happens in this incident.
Yeah, and I think another thing that, you know, of course, is related to this that is noticeable in listening to it is that, you know, if you're running the Marine Corps, your stated mission is maybe twofold. I mean, sort of informally, what we might interpret as your stated mission: win wars, and then also protect the reputation of the Marine Corps. And, you know, it's not like I have no real commentary on whether that, I mean, that seems like a logical job for the head of the Marine Corps. I think that the question that we were raising is, okay, now you put the role of prosecutor of the service members within that same structure. And that's, I think, where all the questions start to be raised. So like an organization that is tasked with winning wars and protecting its reputation, should that organization also be the same organization to prosecute its members? You know, we do not have that in the civilian world. You know, I mean, if you steal from your boss doesn't prosecute you. You know, your boss might fire you, but the prosecution is handled by someone who's never met you before, who doesn't, you know, it's a totally different, who doesn't, you know, have any relationship to you, care about you at all. Now, obviously, there's huge problems in the US and the rest of the criminal justice system. I'm not downplaying those, but there's a very particular thing that's happening structurally. And I think so that then when you're talking to the commandant, you know, he is talking about it really from a reputational standpoint. You know, that is the focus in that interview, with some prompting by the interviewer to take it down that line. But that did seem to be kind of where that conversation was going. And, you know, one of the things that we contrasted that with in the podcast is the difference between that and the public remarks. And the public remarks were very much about sort of acknowledging the severity of the allegations of what had happened and all that. But privately, the tone, and in this different context, it was very different.
Okay, well, I'm sure everyone here is here to because they know or they heard the podcast and so on. But just so that we can backtrack a little bit, what happened in Haditha, if you can recount that story?
Sure. So on the morning of November 19th, 2005, A squad of U.S. Marines who had been stationed in Haditha were on a routine patrol through town. They were going to basically drop some supplies and some Iraqi army soldiers off at like one outpost in town and then like come back and go back to their base, basically. And so they go there, they do their drop off, it's fine. On their way back, one of the Humvees in their 4 Humvee caravan is hits an IED, explodes, and kills a Marine Corps Sergeant Miguel Terrazas instantly, and injures 2 other Marines. And in the next several hours after, and the place where the IED happened was on just like of course it was in a road, and it was basically in a residential neighborhood. There were houses overlooking the road, and in the hours that follow, the Marines from that squad, several of the Marines from that squad go on to enter houses in that neighborhood and kill civilians, and they kill men, women, children. Many of the people who are killed are shot in the head. In 2 striking instances, they go into one house, they shoot into a living room, and they shoot a mother and a child who are both found, or shoot at a mother and a child. They're both found dead, with the mother in the corner of the living room, like with her arm around her 4-year-old son. In the next house that they went into, they went into a back bedroom and they killed a mother who was lying on a bed with all of her children surrounding her. And one child actually managed to survive that and recount for us the story as an adult of what happened. And then they went to a final house and killed 4 adult men, all brothers. And they also killed people by the side of the road and also killed another person. So it's basically like several hours of killing that happened. And then when all of that was done, other Marines came in and they were told to like drag out the bodies, clean it up, take the bodies out of the house, take them to the morgue. That's where the families found them the next day. And then the official story about what happened in Haditha was that, according to the US military, which was released to the press at the time, was that there had been basically like an altercation, like an IED and crossfire, and civilians had died. But there was not an acknowledgement that Marines had gone into the houses and been the ones who killed the civilians. It was like they were caught in the middle of something. And it wasn't until many months later that the truth of what happened in Haditha started to trickle out. There was a reporter for Time magazine who was contacted by people in Iraq who told him, he was in Iraq at the time, who told him that a video existed of the aftermath of what had happened. He was shown the video. He ends up publishing a story about it the following year, so 2006, and that's what launches, and like him informing the military is what launches the investigation into what happened in Haditha. And so at that moment, when Time magazine publishes, there's a ton of media interest nationally and internationally. And there's a lot of vows to like do everything we can to get to the bottom of this, like I was referring to earlier. And then several Marines are charged, but slowly over many years, those cases fade away. Their charges dismissed, downgraded, dropped, until finally, many years later, in 2012, the squad leader, a man named Frank Wuterich, goes on trial. And at this point, like, the world has really moved on from this story. And in the middle of the trial, he accepts a plea deal which involves dropping almost all of the charges. He pleads guilty to one charge, which is negligent dereliction of duty, which is like an extremely minor charge. I believe you can get this charge for like falling asleep while on like a post, being like a sentry or something. And so he doesn't serve a day behind bars for that, and the whole thing ends. And the records are sealed, and that's it. And so that's the story of what happened in Haditha as we encountered it. There were so many aspects of the story that were not known. And of course, one of the biggest ones is that, certain type, like I think this is a really important thing to keep in mind with Haditha and with all these stories about things that happen in war, is that we say how much we care about something by the level of detail that we afford to it. When there is, say, a school shooting in the United States, it is often the case that we will learn there'll be a report that's issued that will provide meticulous detail, almost like a moment by moment of what happened. And the point of that is not that we can undo it. It's not often even to prosecute the person who often has killed themselves. I believe it's like almost an effort of saying like these people's lives mattered. And so we are going to make an accounting and try to understand because they mattered what happened here. Maybe there's other lessons to be gained, but at its root is an act of empathy. And I think that when you have something happen like what happened in Haditha, you see something very different, which is that there's just sort of a sense of like a fog of war, like a chaos that happened, and like these civilians ended up dead. And I guess it was the Marines who ended up killing them, but there's not that same level of knowledge that was transmitted to the public about exactly what happened. So there was that question that was hidden of what actually happened that day in its most detailed version. There was also this hidden history of the role of members of the families who, like the survivors, their role in bringing this to light and their ongoing effort to try to have some measure of justice for what happened to their family members. And so that was also an important part of the story for us to tell as well. But there was a lot like that in this story that was just, and then I guess the third is everything that has to do with how the US military prosecutes these cases, like very little of which had been examined. I mean, we were interviewing lawyers in the Marine Corps and in the US military more generally, who are not the sort of people that routinely are interviewed in stories, talking about how they handled this case. So it was really an effort to try to reconstruct what happened, but more than anything, to ask this question of why was no one punished for what happened that day?
Two things. One is that you approach this story from an institutional perspective that the Marines should respond, and then of course there were attempts to approach the defendants. You meet with them individually and so on. And so, what was sort of that experience like? I know you may have to recount some events there, like trying to get the Marines to give you documents, of course, is its own challenge, but also trying to get the stories from the defendants and the family. So I guess trying to figure out your investigative approach toward each group, trying to get the storytelling from each, and what were your tools, what was your approach, and how did it go?
So for the Marines, there were sort of two groups of Marines. There were the Marines who were the shooters that day, and those individuals, I mean, one of them granted us a pretty short interview, but for the most part, they didn't want to talk to us. We did go to their homes, and we tried everything you would try to do. We went to their homes, we sent them letters, we called them on the phone. In some cases, if we had an email, we emailed them. But by and large, they did not want to comment. But the Marines, those Marines were just one squad of like a much larger unit that was stationed in Haditha. And a lot of Marines responded in the immediate aftermath, of the IED exploding, and were involved in, like, were tasked with going into the houses and taking the bodies. And so there were a lot of people who witnessed very important aspects of this who were on the Marine side of the equation. And so our team, myself and other people on our team, traveled around the United States, knocking on doors, talking to those Marines. And, we interviewed, I think, more than 30 Marines who played some role in what happened that day, which was tremendously valuable in trying to reconstruct exactly what happened and so many other related points. And, I think that one of our findings from going to conduct that side of the interviews was that, these people, by and large, I mean, not everybody. There were some people who absolutely didn't want to talk, but many people really did want to talk about this. And it was not like a monolith. It wasn't as though we showed up at people's houses and everybody was like so proud of what had happened that day, like quite the contrary in many cases. We talked with many Marines who were deeply, deeply troubled by what had happened that day and spoke openly about that, and had, at the time, questioned, just seeing it, and questioned immediately what had happened and the story that was being told about what happened. And so they turned out to be some of our best sources. And I think, several of them expressed how it was not very often that they had the opportunity to really talk about what happened from their perspective on their deployments. And so, those are sometimes interviews that stretch for many, many hours. On the Iraqi side, we started out by contacting Khalid Salman Rasif, who is a lawyer and also a family member of many of the people who died that day. He's related to, I believe, 15 of the people who were killed that day. His sister died, many other people in his family. And pretty quickly, he was a man who in Haditha at the time was like a member of the city council. He was a lawyer. He was a prominent person, and he took on the role pretty early on as like a family spokesperson. And so he connected us with the rest of his family, and then also with the other surviving family members who he wasn't related to, but also was sort of acting as a spokesperson for. We worked with a reporter who was at the BBC, who traveled to Haditha because at the time it was considered not safe for us specifically to travel on certain roads that we would have to travel as Western ladies, like to get into Haditha, basically, like the risk of kidnapping to go not in Haditha itself, but some of the roads leading into it was not considered safe by the security consultants. And so, but Namak, who we worked with, had kind of a different situation. He's Kurdish. He's well traveled in the area. He travels with the security team. And so it was believed that he could do this, relatively safely. And indeed, he did do it safely. And so he went to Haditha and conducted many interviews. And then we traveled to, myself and another producer on our team traveled to Erbil. And many of the Haditha survivors traveled from Haditha to Erbil to meet with us there. And then we met with them over many days there as well. And, one of the first questions we had in the reporting before we really got too far along was just, how do the survivors feel about this? Do they want to talk? I mean, we just didn't know. And any answer would have been totally acceptable and reasonable under the circumstances. If someone had said, I never want to talk about this for another second in my life, I would very much understand that. But instead, it was quite the opposite for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, where even though it was very painful to talk about, which you hear in the podcast, to a person, the people we spoke with wanted to tell the story of what happened that day, and they wanted that story to reach as wide an audience as possible. And so they were committed, very committed to doing that. And then they ended up, all the survivors really that we interviewed ended up also signing, like playing a big role in us getting the photos from the US military. So they, two of the survivors, Khalid Salman Rasif, the lawyer I mentioned, and then another Khalid who is a generation younger, Khalid Jamal, whose father and uncles were killed that day. They went door to door in Haditha with a form that we had translated into Arabic that was essentially like a photo release form that we were filing as part of our lawsuit against the military, saying that the survivors were okay with us having the photos released to us, because we expected that the US military would say that it was only out of respect for the survivors that they weren't going to give us the photos. So we wanted to, address that argument head on. And so, they went, the survivors went to really tremendous lengths to help us in this investigation. And, we're trying to figure out exactly what happened. These are really excruciating interviews. And I think that their patience with us was remarkable. But I also think that, I think about the interviews that we did with two of the women whose husbands were killed that day, Najla and Ehab. And I was also struck by how they were able to also very beautifully convey their lives before all of this happened. Who were their husbands? What was their family like? What was their community like before all of this? And so we're just so tremendously grateful to the survivors for their role in this.
Before I go back to asking how to work with the Marines, one of the military figures, he was talking about the lawyer because he'd been approached by the lawyer, And then he said that all these people want is the money. And of course, the money has already been settled in that I think the US has determined that for every Iraqi civilian dead, it's $2,500 or something to that effect, and that's it. So, so the credibility of the families was questioned from day one, at least. And then also the idea there was a US Marine who died in the improvised IED. And so the idea was, well, we had some of you died on your side, and we had one of our own died. And so, it's kind of like, that's it. So we should be equal, which is, of course, as in many, big empire countries, is always one of us is worth many more of you, in many, 23 of you in this case. But so how did were the families, of course, I mean, imagine they were offended by the accusation of the money and so on, but was that like a certain part of the military culture towards civilians in Iraq that they are just in it for the money, or that they're different people, or all of these things about them, that the Iraqis have a different mentality from ours, the othering of the Iraqis? How did that play as part of the stalling, part of the non-cooperation in some cases, at least institutionally?
It was a really key part of it. I mean, there were things that happened that were very striking to me, such as, we had depositions. So in the investigation that eventually happened, the survivors, including the children survivors, child survivors, gave detailed depositions about what happened. And the purpose of that was for the criminal investigation. But when the trial of Frank Wuterich happened, for example, the survivors were not called, like none of that information was even used. And I think that if you think about that as applied to, say, a normal quote unquote murder trial in the United States, like if you had, 6 witnesses or something to the murder, and those are the only witnesses that you had, and you didn't call any of them to trial, and not because, they were had criminal convictions for lying or something, they nothing like that, you just chose not to call them.
Or in determining the sentence, survivors are brought in when that happens in America.
Right. So they're completely shut out. And, there was a very telling interview that another member of our team did with a lawyer who was involved in on the government side of that case, who basically acknowledged that he sort of just didn't, thinking about it now, he never really thought about it from this perspective of the survivors, which again, as applied to a regular justice system. I mean, we have whole divisions now, very common in a prosecutor's office to have a victim's advocate role.
Yeah.
And there were people that play that to a certain degree in the US military, but the kind of idea behind it that, it's so important for the victims of the crime to be involved in every stage, and involved or at least informed of every stage, that was lacking. The survivors told us that they didn't find out what had happened except from on the news or on social media. And I think that, that, I mean, when you think about, also the role of someone like Khalid Salman Rasif, who was the one who had organized all this. I mean, he had put this, his family members, young family members in this position. He thought it was a good thing to do, to talk to the investigators. And then they did that. And it was, of course, difficult, very difficult to do that. And then nothing ends up coming from it. Then he's dealing with all of those complicated emotions from all of that. And I think that, there are other details, if we're talking about just dehumanizing, about what happened that day that are definitely under the category of dehumanizing, where you have Marines playing with, in some cases playing with body parts, things that are by definition dehumanizing. And so there were, those sort of the act itself of what happened, but then also the way that everything unfolded after that.
Okay, approaching the Marines as an institution, had you worked with the Sunshine Laws before, and for other investigation, and how was this different? And if you can again recount a little bit of the saga, because it involved many petitions to the Supreme Court and so on. So if you can tell us how was it that different, and then recounting the story.
Yeah, so this was one of the more challenging aspects of this story. I mean, this is a story that took us a little over 4 years of to complete. And, unfortunately, in some ways it did take that long because that's how long it took to get what we ended up getting from FOIA, from Information Act. So we started out, one of the very first things we did, I think back in February of 2020, is we filed a bunch of FOIAs to the US military and the federal government in general, seeking information about the Haditha investigations and prosecutions. And as is often the case, when you file a FOIA request, you're met with like basic silence, And so we just weren't getting anywhere. And we know that with FOIA, especially when you're FOIAing like a large government entity that's getting, thousands of FOIA requests, that you're going to sit in a line that's going to take till the end of time, maybe, unless you get a lawyer. And so there was a lawyer that I had been wanting to work with for some time who specializes in FOIA work. So by definition at the federal level, and his name is Matt Topic. And so we arranged that he would work with us, and then we started suing the US military. And so we filed several lawsuits against them, seeking basically a number of things, including the full investigative file of the criminal investigation into what happened in Haditha, the full prosecution records, the photos, other things. And slowly, some of that information, we started to get things, like we got the trial transcript of Frank Wuterich, for example. We got the NCIS investigative file. But certain things were withheld and many things were redacted. And one of the things that were withheld were the photos. And so that began like quite lengthy process of trying to strategize about that. The photos had been sealed at the end of Frank Wuterich's trial because they were on multiple grounds. One was national security. One was, which is sort of related, was that the idea that service members could be harmed if these photos were made public.
Were they shown on the trial, the photos? Were they shown in
Yes,
the
they were shown at trial, but there's no video. I mean, there's nothing that public that exists from that trial. So, but yeah, they were shown in the courtroom. I think many, if not all of them, were shown in the courtroom. So you'd see reference to them, in the trial record. You would see a forensic expert talking in great detail about some of them, but they weren't included. And so, like I mentioned, the survivors helped by signing this form. And basically what our lawyers argued, is that these photos are absolutely newsworthy. They're a definition of something that's in the public interest to see. And that these other arguments, well, number one, like this argument that the survivors could be harmed, because that was the other argument, that the survivors could be harmed by these photos being made public. Well, see, the survivors are saying they want the photos to be made public to us. And eventually the government relented and released us the photos. But that happened very late. That happened in just a couple months before the podcast came out. So we did not expect to get those photos by any means. And then once we had them, then we had a different challenge because, we did not, we had like dozens of photos. And these were photos that were just taken sort of haphazardly in some cases, I think it's safe to say, like by Marines in the hours after the killing. So these are not photos that show the moment of the killing, but they show the aftermath. And many of them were incredibly graphic. Some of them were very close-up shots. And then others were graphic, but were also really rich with information. And so they told us, for example, really key facts about where a shooter might have to be standing in order to make a certain shot, or, that photo combined with, the measurements which we had of the room suggested that certain things had to have happened, which aren't, pretty important pieces of the puzzle. And so we had to decide, what are we going to do with these photos? Are we going to publish these photos? And so that then began a whole discussion on our team, with not just our team, but our editors, others at the New Yorker, about what was appropriate, because what I didn't want to do is continue this dehumanization. And so it was a balance. And so where we landed was we were going to publish 10 photos that were the photos that were journalistically important and showed us something. And we were not going to publish the photos that were just graphic photos that don't, I mean, as soon as you publish a photo, it's everywhere, you know, so you have to keep that in mind as well. And so we wanted to have some kind of thoughtful decision-making process that wasn't just release them all into the world and sort of see what happens, because there is a potential negative consequence of having those images forever associated with your family. So we wanted to take care of that. We also asked the survivors what they wanted. And so in one case, Khalid Jamal, the one whose father and uncles were killed, he did not want the photos of his family released. We gave him the photos, so he has them, but he didn't want them made public, and so we didn't make those photos public. So it was a really careful decision-making process to try to do that. And I shouldn't say, like, I don't think that process, that exact process is required in every instance or something like that, but just the particulars of this story, the way that we obtain the photos, the nature of the story, the involvement of the survivors, the passage of time, all of these things, like that was what felt right for us.
Well, I have something with the stories. One, of course, we live in a highly photographing culture, if you will. Everybody's taking a picture of everything, and everybody's taking a picture of everything that's around them. So I don't know if what the Marines who took the photos, did you think they had a sense of history, or were they just documenting? What was their sense of why they took the photos? Of course, photos among soldiers are in many cases, and we're also seeing that in Gaza, they're coming back as evidence of war crimes. But in this case, what did you think were the motivation? This is before smartphones too, so yeah.
Yeah, these were like actual cameras. Yeah, it's like really, it's funny how, you know, there's not much time has passed, but yet the technological world is totally different.
Cameras, so they had their cameras on them. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and so, you know, they were doing there's a bunch of different reasons. And so they weren't just the photos that we have. I mean, we have a couple of photos that we just happened upon in our reporting that are people, like one guy had in a scrapbook, which were just photos of one of the buildings that was very badly burned later. But in terms of these types of photos, they were taken basically on the orders of various people within that unit. So, you know, they were supposed to, one of the things that they needed to do was to see if there were any known terrorists in the dead. And so there's a process for doing that has a photographic element. So that's one reason to take photos. Another reason to take photos is like, I think they were just trying to deal with like this many bodies and, you know, and it was just part of the process of like, they would photograph and then before. And so they had marked, as you can see in the photos we published, that the bodies are all marked with numbers. I mean, this is, if we also talk about dehumanization.
Crime scene issue, sort of.
Yeah, but they're like marked like on their faces, like a big number. And so that, you know, so there's like an attempt maybe to keep things together, but I don't think that they were not criminal investigators. This was not like the forensic photographers came in and did this. These were all just members of the unit. And of course it wasn't investigated initially. And, you know, there are believed to be more photos that have never, you know, reached the light of day. I mean, the other thing we learned was that the Marines in the unit, not all of them, but some of them were swapping the photos on like a PlayStation, because they'd be like on a little drive that you could like plug into like a Sony PlayStation and like swap images that way. And so at the time, these images were sort of circulating on the base as well that way. You know, one of the things that ends up happening, I mean, the military investigators don't get there until months later. And so who knows, you know, how many more photos maybe there were. You know, I did interview one of the people who was involved in taking the photos. And for him, it wasn't like a ghoulish thing. It was just like part of his job that he was doing that.
How would not getting the photos have affected your storytelling? Did you think you could tell the story still without getting the photos, or without the
We planned to. I mean, we would have. I think that what the photos show you is something that, like, it's one thing to read about something and sort of visualize it and hope that the description of it is accurate. It's another thing to see the photos for yourself, to be able to know, like journalistically, to be able to say like, okay, this is actually the photo. Now I can take this to a forensic expert and they can look at the photo, versus like, and some of the photos had been released before, but not the whole set. And um, so that was tremendously valuable. I think that there is something powerful in a very devastating way about seeing some of what happened, because the argument and the way it had been talked about in public was sort of a fog of war situation. And, we can write all we want about how various things might suggest that it might not be a fog of war situation. But if you see, like the photo in the first house of the mother, Asma, with her 4-year-old son, Abdullah, and her arm around, I mean, you don't really need a whole lot of explanation upon seeing a photo like that. I mean, the photo is so stark. Or if you see the photo of that next house of the mother in the back bedroom surrounded by her children, I mean, there's just not, like, there's something just incredibly powerful about seeing those photos contrasted with the story that we've been presented with before then. That is more powerful than a written description. On the other hand, I do think that we become so desensitized to images that I think one of the things that was interesting feedback that we got from people who listened to the podcast was that they found the most powerful experience to be the episode where we describe ourselves seeing the photos and what we're seeing in the photos. And that was, versus looking at the photos, because, nowadays, if I go on X or something, my whole feed is nonstop, really graphic photos from Gaza, for example, And so these photos are just existing in a time where there's just a lot of this kind of content that's on the internet. And we've just become a little bit, it doesn't have the same power to sort of shock us maybe as it once did.
Yeah, well, description becomes how you make meaning out of things, which is, yeah. I'm going to open it up soon, but I'm out of some more questions, perhaps. I guess for maybe you, how did this story sort of resonate as differently from how did it resonate differently from the other stories, which involved also a great deal of injustice? But how did this how was it different in some ways for you and your team?
Yeah, I think the main way that it was different was, I mean, okay, first, obviously the scale of what we're looking at is an obvious point, but I think more than the scale of the actual incident itself was the fact that we were put in this position, just sort of as journalists, of having information that the survivors didn't have, and then needing to walk very carefully through that reality. So what I mean more specifically is, we would have, for example, the Marine statements, the shooters, of what they said happened inside the houses. Then I would be talking to people who'd lived at one point inside those houses and whose family members were killed. And I would know that I had this information that I knew that they didn't have. And so we had a lot of conversations and a lot of thought on our team about how to handle that. And basically where we landed is that we are always going to offer the option of providing that information, but we are always going to allow it to be a choice. And so you even hear this a little bit on the podcast, where there's always like an asking first of, do you want me to tell you this? And sometimes, it would be like an immediate, like, yes, I want to know. And other times it'd be like, I need to think about it. And so that was a unique thing. I mean, it's always the case, of course, in journalism, you're finding out things that before you publish, people don't know. But the kinds of things that we were finding out in this reporting were things like what happened in the final moments of your father's life. They're just on a level of importance, a personal importance to people. And that was more emotionally heightened than anything I had previously encountered, just because of the nature of the story. And so I felt a real responsibility to try to to try not to harm anybody more than they've been harmed, and to try to respect everybody's autonomy to make decisions. It was just that part of the story was very challenging.
Um, maybe two more questions from me. One is, of course, we did talk about Abu Ghraib, but maybe another massacre that's kind of similar in some ways is My Lai in Vietnam, where you had a commander and his troops ending up just killing civilians. Many more, I think, more than Haditha.
Oh, many more. Yes, hundreds.
And in this case, there was also a military court martial, and then there was an immediate pardon by President Nixon, and so on. And I guess the issue there was the idea of this wasn't really a fog of war, but that somehow it's almost like these incidents ends up questions about patriotism and loyalty, and in a sense, a test for the nation's resolve to stay together rather than sort of justice, where these are. This wasn't really the case here, but even within maybe the Marines, how much was really kind of dampening the truth important for the sense of institutional cohesion within the Marines, or even their sense of who they are as a part of the culture? I guess in a sense, how much is dismissing these events or discrediting them part of our psychology as Americans and as our sense of nationality? I mean, that's kind of a big question, if you can meditate on that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think with Haditha, the answer is pretty complicated because you have multiple levels of different people at different levels deciding not to do something, and they're not always for the same reason. And, you know, part of what was going on was just that it's very hard to hold anybody accountable for anything that happens in a war because you're not there. Like if there's a police shooting down my block, it's possible that I could be there. It's possible I could have a cell phone with me. I'm never going to have that there. And so you're sort of trusting, except in very rare cases where there might be a journalist or a citizen journalist or somebody present, you just don't have any information. And so with Haditha, the reasons it was ignored at first, I don't think were explicitly, I didn't find any evidence at least that it was explicitly like, this will make us look really bad and we need to look really good and therefore XYZ. It was more just like, yeah, a lot of people claim a lot of things in war. It was like that kind of like, and there's a lot of things that are going, and I don't, whatever, that's like a busy area, like the people that are higher up in the chain, like maybe I could have looked into this many deaths, but I didn't, or whatever. It was just kind of like one of those things that happens sometimes. In a way, there was like an interesting role of where like thinking like, yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing an insurgent would do, where it wasn't an insurgent that did it. Of course, it was our side. So there were some assumptions about like the behavior of insurgents and what it seemed like. But I think that the biggest story of Haditha overall is that how the intersection of politics in a way, because like when Haditha surfaced finally in 2006, it became a real political issue for a very short period of time. But like Congressman John Murtha gave a big press conference where he spoke out. I called the Marines, I believe, like cold-blooded murderers. I mean, he used very, if not that exact word, something very similar to that. And they actually responded by, in some cases, trying to sue him. But Murtha was, I mean, Murtha's dead now, so I can't ask him what he was trying to do. But I think that what he was trying to do is he was someone who was opposed to the war. And he saw in Haditha an opportunity to bring this issue to the forefront. And he did it in a very particular way. He said this, basically the argument was not like some really bad people joined the Marines and look what they did and our country is terrible or something like that. That's not at all what he was arguing. And that this war was never a good idea. It was like, this war is bad in part because it took like our good men and turned them into these like child killers. And so it's like the fault of the government so that was the claim that he was making, which is like a very particular political claim. And you could say like, okay, well, that's really, if you have the belief that this should be in the news, that's really good that Murtha is getting it out there. But because it was really a political thing that was happening at a very particular moment where the Democrats were really trying to summon outrage over the war in Iraq and George W. Bush was president. Once George W. Bush is no longer president, and once we're in the Obama era, and now the sort of foreign policy in large part of the Obama administration is we're not going to be relitigating the things that happened under the George W. Bush administration. The nature of politics is that, well, then the Democrats, nobody's going to then have an incentive, in this system to bring up Haditha, because arguably the reason to bring up Haditha was this thing that has now passed. And so that I think is one of the larger dynamics that's happening with Haditha. And then certainly by the time you get to Frank Wutterich's trial, which is not until 2012, now you are so past the war in Iraq that even some of the people you might expect would cover that trial were not even covering it because it was like such an old story at that point. And so I think that role is also worth paying attention to in this story, because like the political moment can really elevate something, but it can also, as I think we've seen here, also just downgrade it into, nothingness.
I said two more questions, but I actually remember the questions that I wanted to ask you from the first time I heard the podcast, which is that this is an event that you pursued 20 years later. Also, the victims' families with you. I mean, there was hardly any chance of them getting real justice. There isn't a chance of that happening now. And again, a philosophical question, perhaps, is that the truth then becomes justice? Is that what we have as a compensation for these kinds of things? I mean, because that's what you've done. You provided the truth of the situation, and in a way, the truth becomes a determiner of guilt and not guilt. And sometimes that's what we can get. But what is the interplay between those two? Because if we know the truth, why can't we get justice? But in this case, we know we don't. And so how does the truth become a kind of compensation, if you will, for justice?
I mean, I don't know. I feel like Khalid Salman Rushdie still wants the Marines who did this to be prosecuted. And so I don't believe, I have not checked in with him in the last few months about this question, but based on our previous conversations, I would tell you that I don't believe he, for example, thinks that truth is a good compensation. Like in lieu of justice, at least get the truth out. Like, no, I don't think that's his mentality. I think with investigative reporting, you just can't control the world, and you shouldn't, you are like a separate entity.
Yeah.
And so, all I can do is put the information out there. I can't control like the political moment that it's being brought out into, or anything like that. And that's not just true in this story. I mean, that's true in any story. And I also think that, there is sometimes a little bit of impatience in journalism or in life in general to like do something and then see an immediate impact. And of course, depending on what the impact is, that might be very good. But the reality is, if that doesn't happen, the reality is that more often the case, it doesn't. And then what you're doing as a journalist is you are part of a longer historical moment where what you are doing is being one of many people who are documenting something. I mean, to me, like when I think about the Haditha story, something that I am very grateful that we were able to do is just gather these accounts, gather the documents, post the documents on our website so that anybody can go and look at them, do this type of basic stuff. And then, we also did a huge related component to this story where we looked at we looked at the war crime system within the US military itself. And we also FOIA'd for records of, hundreds of other alleged war crimes and compiled the largest existing database that we're aware of post 9/11 alleged war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan committed by US service members. And so there's like things that we're doing that are more about like building a record of something that I think are also valuable. But I do think that, I would never say, I think what justice means for people is a deeply personal concept. And I just know for the survivors who I've had those conversations with, like justice means traditional justice, like justice in a courtroom justice.
Uh, you spoke about the war crimes justice system, and I know that I mean my hope is for your podcast and your great work is that it will be a kind of inspiration for future investigative reporters and journalists in general. Except that we know, and I don't know to what degree is I don't know if the Hegseth and his people are tuning into your podcast, but I can imagine it's part of their zeitgeist that stuff like that shouldn't come out. And what's the future of these kinds of investigations as far as the Pentagon is concerned? As you know, things are kind of changing when it comes to these. There have been offices closed and reporting duties canceled and so on. Can you give us some sense of what's happened and what's the future of investigations like yours going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I should say that, the reform of the military justice system is always sort of a long shot thing. I mean, there had been, regardless of which party is in power, there had been some incremental reforms, mostly related to how sexual assault allegations were handled within the military that had taken place before. But it's certainly also true that Pete Hegseth in particular, like before he became Secretary of Defense and certainly after, is someone who is particularly outspoken on the concept of war crimes and how he doesn't, I mean, I've read, many of his writings on this. He doesn't really appear to believe in the Geneva Conventions. He doesn't accept that there should be the same kind of limits around what service members can legally do in a conflict. He, will often he wants to make it harder to prosecute service members of alleged war crimes, not easier, and all of those kinds of things. So certainly, he's sort of questioning, at his most sort of interpreted in his most extreme, he's sort of questioning whether there even should be laws of war. Almost, he almost approaches that. And at its most minimal, he's at least suggesting a system where we're not worried that much about breaking those laws. And so certainly the idea that under a Hegseth Department of Defense that they would reopen an investigation into Haditha or something is pretty far fetched, I think. So that's, I mean, so things have definitely gone in an opposite direction. But I also think, there were opportunities to do that previously, to reinvestigate Haditha under, before Trump. And those also, anybody could have picked this up at any point and done something with it, and it didn't happen. And so it's true that Hegseth definitely has different views on war crimes than his predecessors, it appears. But on a practical level, I don't know that it really makes that much of a difference to the Haditha case, because there was not much interest either way.
Okay. All right, as promised, I will stop asking questions and open it up to the room or to Zoom. So anybody has questions for Ms. Baran? Yes, please go ahead.
The podcast very intentionally chronicles the research process and the roadblocks that you and your team faced investigating Haditha. And I think that level of transparency to some extent is pretty unique. And I was wondering why you feel that transparency about how you investigated the case and the legal failures that followed, why you felt that was so crucial to include in your article and in the podcast.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I think for us, because there's actually findings in that part of the story. The fact that it was so difficult for us to get this information is not just a personal story about why reporting is frustrating or something like that. It's a story about, the US military is making it incredibly difficult to get this information. And so chronicling just how difficult that is, or the fact that, there's not a publicly accessible database of allegations of war crimes. That's not just a personal problem that we have in the dark team. That's a public problem, public, it's a problem in a democracy. And so I think that's part of why we show it. We're also trying sometimes in the world of audio to capture things that otherwise we don't, like things that we think are really important that otherwise could come across as very dry. And so we're trying to engage the listener and kind of like have them like be like, yes, I also want to go on this quest with you. This is also important to me. Let's go through it together and then experience kind of a version of all of the emotions that we felt. And then hopefully, you know, the listener, I mean, I'm expecting many, I've heard from many listeners who are just as frustrated as we are about how difficult that was. And that difficulty is itself a finding. But we also, on the other hand, are always careful to not go too far in that, because if you go too far, you kind of risk making it a story about the reporters instead of a story about what you're doing. And so it's a little bit of a balance.
Maybe just related to that, a question from Zoom. Was your, I know your team didn't go to Iraq, but worked with a team there. Was your safety a question? The team's safety a question?
I mean, when we went to Erbil, I mean, not really. I think Erbil was pretty safe. I think, you know, no, I mean, not really. I mean, there's reporters that go to Syria in the middle of a war and they can talk about this. I mean, you know, we do have certain precautions that we took. You know, we did have an incident that I believe you hear in the podcast where a person on our team was in kind of an intense situation at the house of a former service member. And that kind of thing happens. Our team does a lot of door knocking, not just for this series, but just in general. We really believe in an old school approach of just like getting on a plane or getting in a car and driving and going and knocking on someone's door. And so that does create scenarios where you're in unpredictable situations, but we have sort of safety protocols for how we do that. In certain cases, we go out with another person or only at certain times of day. We always know where people in the team are. We always know their license plate number and things like that. So I think it's a pretty, we try to mitigate it as best we can.
Questions? Yes.
Was there in Iraq at that time, when this happened, a lot more accidents or murders that way that were done? Because we saw a lot of soldiers going from house to house to house. So did accident or whatever killings happen regularly, but maybe not to that level?
This was a question. Yeah, this was a question that we had as well. And, we can only, like, looking at Haditha, the short answer is no. This really was not something that happened all the time. And I'm not saying that because that's what the US military says. I'm saying that because of like interviewing people who live in Haditha about what happened during the war. And so this incident immediately stood out as a complete anomaly in Haditha. And I think in all of the war in Iraq, when you're talking about not something like a bomb explosion or something like that, but you're talking about like shooting deaths, this stands out, that you would have this many deaths. And this also raises the question of why was there no investigation to begin with? There are many, many, many stories of one-off deaths. There's a really, really horrifically sad death that happened in Haditha that we read about and learned about, where a father, if I remember the details of the story correctly, had informed the Marines that his son was going to need to dig a hole somewhere. Digging a hole in Iraq is like a very fraught activity, obviously, because everybody thinks that you're probably planting a bomb, but you sometimes do need to dig for some reason, for construction or repair or something. And if I remember this story correctly, he had communicated all that, every possible which way. And then his son was still killed digging that hole. And that kind of like everyday violence is pretty common to find in the record. But, the other thing, and I think this is especially true now, but was starting to come true at the time of Haditha, is you just could not go and kill like 20 civilians and have no Iraqi civilians notice or care about it. So like for there to be like tons of hidden Hadithas, you would need sort of like the civilian population to sort of be in on it, which is just not the case. And so you have lots of like numerically smaller tragedies, but just as, bad, not to say that they're not as bad, but you don't have a whole lot of like this happening on this level. And, you know, and the other thing too is that once this incident hit the news, there were a lot of discussions about like what day-to-day life in Haditha was like, how dangerous was it? And so we did spend a lot of time like researching that and just sort of seeing, and it wasn't the case that there was a ton of, you know, heavy fighting in Haditha or anything like that. And so I think also there, you know, it's interesting to go back and really try to, as best you can, accurately reconstruct what even the conflict looked like at the time, because that can be tricky to do. But certainly this level of death was an outlier.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
How intense was the like propaganda towards Hadith at the time, and just like downplaying like the massacre that went on? Like, could you kind of like explain the scale of the intensity of the propaganda maybe towards it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, you know, first we have this press release that goes out that just says that this is like civilians caught in the crossfire, basically. And we interviewed the person who wrote that press release, and he had no idea. I mean, I think this is legitimate. Like he wasn't like in on it and wrote, he was just given this report and he just wrote this thing that he didn't know was fake or not accurate. And so, but then, you know,
And then, right? Well, there was not, did the news pick it up a lot or?
no.
Yeah.
And this is the other thing too. It's like, the issue with the Haditha killings is that it happened in a region that was very challenging for reporters to go to. And so that's the other issue here. Like, there were legitimate, serious safety concerns about traveling to that region. And so that does sound like a lot of deaths. You know, it was like a small article. It was like I saw like a couple like kind of like AP type wire stories, like three paragraphs maybe, you know, or even less than that. You know, but it was sort of portrayed as like, well, you know, the Sunni triangle is sort of a mess anyways. And so like, this is the sort of thing that happens there. But they didn't do a lot of propaganda around it because there really wasn't any attention given to it. Like it wasn't front page news. It wasn't like not even second, third page news. It was something that like you could be like a daily reader of all newspapers and not recall that you read it later that day because that's how little, you know, it was given. So I think that was really the main way that this became, you know, and so, yeah, and then later on, you know, there was not a rush to, actually the opposite, like all of the public statements were, we are taking this seriously. They're not necessarily saying that it was a war crime, but they're saying like, this is like an allegation of a serious potential atrocity type of language, you know? So it wasn't downplaying what had happened there at all. It was really like the media strategy seemed to be to like really get in front of it. But then after a long time, you know, nothing ends up coming of the prosecutions, but at least initially, the posture of the military was to say that we're taking this very seriously. And also, you know, there were people within the military, and we see this from like high-ranking officials who were legitimately outraged by what they were learning had happened. Because, you know, if you think about like the military structure, like chain of command, they were not told. Like the story of Haditha, as far as I can tell, is not a story of like a top to bottom cover up. It's more like the top, like I found no evidence and suggestions to the contrary that the very top like knew that this happened and covered it up or something like that. And so you also see internal emails where people are really angry that they have not been kept informed because if nothing else, you know, now they have a huge like PR disaster, but also like some genuine concern for what happened there, you know, and there's different, you know, the military is not like a monolithic structure. It's made up of people. And so there's a wide range actually within that organization. There's certain dominant themes, but within that organization, the more you report into it, the more you see those differences, you know, and so there were people that were like, this is wholly unacceptable, you know, and then other people saying like, we shouldn't even reinvestigate this. Like, I just believe the Marines are 100% correct. And even if they aren't, I don't even, you know, so you see that range as well. So, but yeah, and then there wasn't really a need to do any propaganda to sort of make it go away. I think like news cycles and passage of time and kind of the impatience or short memories of journalists did the rest of the work.
Yeah, I think just maybe the idea that maybe the Sunni triangle, just the naming that area like as a danger zone is kind of like preemptive propaganda to anticipate these kinds of situations, perhaps. Katrine?
Yeah, so thank you for sharing and for all the work that you do. I'm a grad student researching refugee experiences and identity formation, specifically like Syrian refugees. And while I was listening to the podcast, I was really struck by how you show institutions like erasing people's humanities through like language, bureaucracy, and silence. And in my research, I kind of see a similar struggle of refugees being like reduced to these cases or numbers or data points, right? So I guess my question is, how do you as a journalist preserve people's dignity while exposing these systems that so often strip it away?
Yeah, it's something that I think a lot about, our whole team thinks a lot about at every stage of what we're doing, like from the story selection to the reporting and then to the writing and everything that comes after. I think I'm a big believer in being transparent with people that I'm talking to about these matters. And so, wanting to talk to the survivors early and making sure that they felt listened to was really important to me. I felt like, we wanted to make sure, to also show not just the moments of the killings themselves, but also a sense of the lives, at least of some of the people who were killed before. And so you're seeing not like a bunch of bodies on the floor of a living room, but you're seeing like people who you now know or a family who you've gotten to know. I think also showing the sort of differences in approaches within a family. And this is just, I think, important in general when reporting on anything involving trauma, to sort of show how people respond and react differently. And so I think you see that in the podcast as well. And we also made some really particular decisions in the audio production. So there's a moment in one of the episodes where Najla, whose husband was killed, she speaks for quite some time, very emotionally, and she's speaking in Arabic, of course. And we just let it run for way longer than would be typical of what you would expect to hear in something that's produced for the English-speaking audience. And that was a very intentional decision. I mean, we later say we allow space and then we say what Najla said, but we wanted to have this experience of having her like unmediated, just speaking directly without an interpreter or anything on top of her. And the interpreter actually in that moment was so upset that she couldn't speak also. And so we included that fact as well to sort of, and we also tried to show the humanity of the interpreter in that moment. And so all of that was, we wanted as much as possible to tell this story in a way that was like this crime had happened anywhere, versus like this is one of those like war atrocity stories or something. We wanted to tell it with an intimacy and like that felt human, that felt like not distant. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how to do that. And I guess that of course is a way of preserving someone's dignity as well. And I also think, we did things in the interviews that I hope were helpful. I think were helpful, such as, spreading out interviews over multiple days, taking breaks. We interviewed, sometimes we interviewed people separately, sometimes we interviewed them together. All of those types of things to try to make people feel as comfortable as they could feel in those moments.
Okay, let me take a question from Zoom and then I'll come back to a question to the room. What do you think of the feasibility of civil cases, whether the Haditha crime, with Haditha situation would resort to civil law for a kind of justice, I guess?
The short answer is I don't know because it hasn't been tried.
Mhm.
And so that's certainly something that it seems like there is a lane that is something that certainly has been considered in other cases that have some similarity just to what happened in Haditha, but hasn't been tried in Haditha. And there is sort of a very narrow lane that's left on criminal prosecution, but it's a little bit hard to fully understand how wide that lane is because we don't have some of the documents, but basically it would involve, there is a possibility, procedurally speaking, for the federal government itself, like federal prosecutors, not the military, to conduct some kind of prosecution potentially of some of this. But a lot of that is complicated by many aspects of what happened in the prosecution, so it's a little hard to say. But yeah, civilly, you know, it's something that, yeah, it does seem like it's something that certainly might be an avenue to pursue.
Yes.
I had a question about when you were interviewing the Marines. Did you ever have anyone like anonymous come to you, like give you like tips or leaks that maybe they weren't allowed to like publicly give to you as we're reporting on them? And then I guess another part of this is like when you were finally like publishing the story, was there any pressure that you would face to kind of like frame the story in a way where like whoever your higher ups were wanted it to be told?
I can answer the second question part very simply. No, there's never any pressure to tell anything other than the biggest, most exhaustively reported possible story. Yeah, and I've actually never felt pressure to do anything other than do the best possible job of investigative reporting in my career. So no, we felt like complete support from the New Yorker and Condé Nast on the story. I think that in terms of like anonymous or off the record people, I'm trying to think now. Nothing substantial. I mean, might there have been odds and ends type of things? Maybe, but nothing major in this story. You know, I understand the importance of anonymous sources and off the record sources, but I also am a big believer in getting people on the record when we can, and not, as best I can, existing in a space where I know things that I know off the record that then puts me in the difficult position of not being able to tell them to the public. So I'm very selective in what I choose to take into the world of like into my like on the record file system, you know, off the record, because I just don't, it can be ethically fraught, I think. So, but no, in this story, no, there was very little that I can't actually recall a single thing right now of that, but I'm assuming there might have been some. But most of it was reported like through very traditional means of just interviews, public records requests, that kind of thing.
Yes.
Was there any remorse expressed by the Marine? Because we had a lot of suicidal in the army when they came back from Iraq. So certainly some of the soldiers were really upset with what happened or what they did there. But so I was wondering if any remorse had been ever expressed.
In terms of we didn't talk to the shooters. You know, there have been some statements made that could be called expressions of remorse, but they were made in a particular sentencing context. So Frank Wuterich released a statement where he talked about his, I guess, I'm not sure that he used the word remorse, but sadness for what had happened. I mean, he was involved in the shootings. He was a squad leader. While at the same time sort of not accepting like specific responsibility for specific shootings. You know, when we talk about expanding out, so there's no like, none of the shooters has come forward and said like, that is the worst day of my life. I can't believe I did that. You know, I need to atone for it in the following ways or something like that. That has not happened. But the Marines who came in the aftermath, several of them have been affected very deeply by this. You know, there's one Marine who declined to talk to us, who played a role in helping to photograph the bodies, who's really struggled a lot with his emotions around this and what he saw. You know, there's, you know, we interviewed, I mean, the intensity of that day for the Marines is that they arrive, they see someone that they know, like this fellow Marine, like literally in 2 pieces or more in the road. And then they go into these houses and see all of these dead children with their moms. And so there's a lot of feelings about that that came up in the interviews, but these are not the people that did any of those things.
Thank you.
I guess was there like a rules of engagement as far as like how to respond to a improvised explosive device? Like if that happens, what were they supposed to do? Yeah.
It's a little, I mean, basically you need to identify who you're shooting at. So you need to be shooting at the enemy, and you need to have a reasonable belief, you have to think you're shooting at the enemy. It has to be can't just be like a wild belief that looks like a kid, I think they're the enemy. No, they need to like look like the enemy. You need to, see a weapon in certain circumstances. Certain things count as weapons, certain things don't. And I think that what's different about this incident, so the story that got sort of told, and this is going to kind of gloss over, different Marines had slightly different defenses, but generally that they believed that they were chasing insurgents from like house to house to house, and that the insurgents were just kind of like outwitting them at every step, and then they would like leave, and so they would never like actually, and like so that to the extent that there were civilians that were killed, the civilians were killed because like the insurgents were running through these places. Now we of course now know that like there does not appear to be any insurgents running through these houses, but that was the argument that was given. And if you look at the rules of engagement, and this becomes part of the prosecution's case, and this is something that many people have pointed out about the Haditha incident, is that you have multiple opportunities to recognize that you just killed a civilian and to sort of reevaluate and stop what you're doing. And that happens from the very first killings, so there are people, there's a white car that's traveling, just happened to be on the road at the same time as the IED went off. Those men pull over to the side of the road, which they're instructed to do, which is standard procedure. They get out. Our reporting would suggest they were following with the commands, and then they were just all shot. And then they search the car. They see that none of those people have weapons. They don't have a bomb. They don't have a detonation device. They don't have anything that would suggest that they were part of the IED exploding. And so then you go into the first house, and there is opportunities to even like make a mistake because you think one thing and then but that also was not part of, it seems, what was going on. Like there wasn't. And then when you get to the final house, you have a more stark dispute, which is you have the Marines claiming one thing happened and the survivors claiming an entirely different thing. I mean, the Marines claim that they showed up at this house, it was a courtyard with 2 houses in it, and they showed up and they asked the women and children, where are all the men? And the women pointed to the other house. And so the women and the children all stay in this house. The Marines go into the second house where they are confronted by an armed insurgent trying to like aim a gun at them. The Marines shoot that person to save their own lives, and another insurgent comes forward, and then they kill it turns out to be 4 insurgents total. They kill all the insurgents. The survivors tell this completely different story, which is like they lived in a courtyard with 2 houses. One family lived in one family lived in the other, and the Marines came that day and basically had them all out in the courtyard at a certain point and separated them and put like the women and the children on one part in one group and put the 4 adult men in a second group, and then marched the 4 adult men into the house. And then a short while later, they heard gunfire, and then the Marines ran out and they went in and everybody was dead. And so that version of the story is an absolute clear violation of the rules of engagement if that story is accurate. And so it just kind of depends on, the prosecution did have to like walk this, very detailed line through like which parts of this violated which aspects of the rules of engagement. But the final house, which Wuterich, by the way, was not even on trial for, although he was one of the 2 shooters in that house, is maybe the starkest potential example of that violation.
Was there anything about the fact that they were coming back because they had gone one direction and then came? Did they think that the device was put in after they were being witnessed going, or is that why they felt like, oh, this is the people who did it? I mean, did that play a part in their thinking, or could it have been just?
buried in the road. So
They-
it would,
Yeah.
I think it, I mean, I don't think they thought that it was like literally put in there that same day.
Yeah.
You know,
Just that they didn't hit it
Generally-
the way it's going.
generally speaking, like some of the stuff that came out in the investigation, and I'm not talking here about any particular Marine, but just sort of in multiple statements, there was an idea that certainly like this neighborhood would have had to have known that an IED was getting buried in the road. And so like one person we talked to was the civil affairs officer talked about this, where it's like, come on, but like those people knew, they would have known, like they should have said something, you know, like in the neighborhood, they could have seen it being planted by insurgents. And why didn't they tell us? And so, you know, like that's kind of what happens, guys, if you don't tell us. And then the story that we tell about that is, and why we call the first episode The Green Grass, is because Khalid Salman Rasif tells us the story about how, you know, look, the civilians are caught in between these two worlds in the town at the time. I mean, they're trying not to get killed by the insurgents, and they're trying to not get killed by the Marines. And like one of these groups, the insurgents, have like so much power over their, you know, like the Marines go home, they like go back to the base, like they're done for the day. And then, you know, I mean, the insurgents were like leaving people beheaded on a bridge, you know, who they believed to cooperate with the Americans. And so this idea that was almost kind of sometimes almost flippantly discussed by the Marines of like, well, why didn't they warn us? It's like, well, I think we can probably figure out why they wouldn't do that, even if they did know, which they didn't, not everybody knew this, but like, even if you literally just sat in like your window in your kitchen and just looked and saw it planted, if you literally walked to the base and insurgents saw you walking to the base and figured out what you had done, like it would be pretty reasonable to assume that like you and the rest of your family would all be murdered. And so, you know, like you have to consider that as well. And so he talked about how he gave this example of this, you know, kind of parable, like, or saying really, you know, when which we translated from Arabic, but basically like when two elephants fight, the only victim is the green grass, and they are this green grass, these civilians in this story caught between these two elephants fighting.
The questions? Yes.
I wanted to ask slightly more general question about the nature, like the mediums of investigative reporting. So you chose obviously to do this mostly like through a podcast form. Like, do you think that comes with any benefits or like downsides versus like more traditional, like just written newspapers?
Yeah, I mean, for me, what I like about working in audio, especially doing investigative reporting, is that I think that you can reach maybe more diverse, more eclectic, and also very large audience with your reporting. And there's something about the intimacy of audio that many people have described more eloquently than me, that I think makes these types of stories particularly resonate. You know, there's a difference when you're hearing, and I think these, by the way, are also qualities that are shared with documentary film, but there's something about seeing another person, hearing another person. There's the other reality too, that the way that people are listening to podcasts by and large is the medium is such that it's like you are being talked to directly, which I guess you could argue is maybe this experience of reading, but I feel like there's something sort of cognitively different that's going on. You know, I don't often think that like, the author of a book is just literally speaking directly to me, but in the wording of it. But in a podcast like that, really, we are writing to like to single listener. We're not writing to like the group. And of course, the act of listening to podcasts, similar to reading, is a solitary act. You know, you're not usually listening to a podcast with like 10 friends or something. But I think hearing the voices, I think, is very powerful. I think also, you know, we want to tell a really compelling story. Like we want to pay attention. It's really important to us that our findings resonate with people and that they care about them. And we are not naive to how many different things people could choose to read, watch, or listen to. And so we know that we need to make sure that like the reasons why this story matter, like why it is compelling, not, you know, like silly narrative tricks or whatever. I'm just like the main story, like, is that coming through? Like why this is this sort of thing that you should spend time with. And so we spend a lot of time on that as well. And I think that, you know, it's, yeah, we hope that people find us through all kinds of ways. And I think the other thing we've noticed in podcasts is that, whereas I think there is a little bit sometimes with print where someone will say, or online, where it's like, if I'm interested in this topic, I will read this story, but if I'm not interested in it already, maybe I won't. Whereas with podcasts, the world is much more of like, is this going to be interesting? Is this like an interesting story? And so you end up with listeners who haven't really thought through a lot of the issues you're exploring, which is what you want. Like, you do not want to be just like telling your story to a bunch of like Army JAG officers. Do you know what I mean? Who are like, yeah, like I'm very well aware of these issues in the military justice system. And that's, so we've seen that like with our reporting where we've really managed to reach people who didn't think that they had an interest in the particular thing that we were reporting on, but just were like, oh, I'll check this out. Here it is like in my phone, and end up getting sucked into it.
I guess one of the things that struck me about that as a narrative approach is the length. There was BBC has some of these multi-episode podcasts, but what was your decision making in your teams about the length of it? How much time did you need? How much time did you think your audience could stay with you as you told the story? How did you, did you think maybe we can't keep them for that long, or no, because of the nature of the story, we need to do it this way because it's so layered? Tell us about that sort of decision making.
Sure. So we always start with, what do we need to tell? What are our findings? What is the information that we need to get out there? And then everything sort of follows from there. And so with this, there arguably was an opportunity to tell a smaller story of maybe just the final house. And we did have a little bit of like, well, that is one option, that would maybe be easier for the listener. It's less terrible information, but that wasn't a really serious option for us because it was like, no, we need to tell the story of everything that happened that day. Journalistically, we want to do that. And so it's a balance. I think for us, we never start out at the beginning saying this is going to be 8 episodes or something. We have a sense that it's going to be many episodes, but it's not really until we sit down and we start kind of structuring the storytelling after we've done a lot of reporting that we really lock into a number of episodes. We certainly worried about with this series, could listeners stick with this? Because it's such a at times hard listen. But we just felt like, well, what are we supposed to do about that? At a certain point, it's like, yeah, what happened is hard to handle. And so I guess it will take a listener who is willing to endure some of that for the sake of learning what happened that day. You try to make it as listenable as you can to a certain degree so you don't feel like you're being abused by the journalist or something, but there's just some inevitability that like it is going to be trying at times to go through that. But we felt that it was important. And, we spend a lot of time we spend months and months and months on the writing. And so we're also cutting a lot. We had other things in here that, ended up being, there's always things in a story that end up being not essential to the task at hand that end up getting cut. So you don't go on forever. And because you do recognize people have their limits. So it's a balance.
One last quick question. Haditha was, because it was, away from Baghdad, it wasn't part of the sort of the sectarian tension and the sort of the emergence of a Shiite leadership and so on. Basically their experience of violence was through the insurgency and the US military. So, and as you mentioned that there were, I don't know how many people died from the town, but your sense from your context there and the victims' families and so on is, what is Haditha like now post this violence 20 years later?
Well, Haditha kind of very much prides itself on its resilience. And one of the remarkable facts about Haditha is so after the war in Iraq ended, of course, you have the rise of ISIS, and Haditha is one of the few towns in that area that did not fall to ISIS, which is kind of amazing, actually. It's like a very small town, and they just have extremely high security measures. Not to say that other towns didn't, but like Haditha really, and so to this day, you cannot, at least at the time of the reporting, you could not just like go to Haditha. You had to be like met at the gates by a person who was authorized to bring people into Haditha, is my understanding. So like when Namak, the reporter we worked with, went to Haditha, he like waited at the gates and Khalid came out and like basically like authorized his entry into the city. It's, you know, it's really kind of a, I mean, just in terms of what it looks like, I mean, it's a very like lush, it's right on the river, has like really lush sections, that are sort of surprisingly so, you know, that you wouldn't necessarily think of when you think of Iraq, or that part of Iraq, but like in that part, it is that way. And you know, it's like a small, pretty conservative, religious town with a lot of families that have lived there for a very long time. But I do think that's really its defining feature in the last little while, is that they're the town that stood up to ISIS and somehow won.
Right. I don't have any more questions, but I have a great deal of gratitude and appreciation for you joining us today. Thank you so much for your presentation and for engaging us. And I certainly look forward to your new series of podcasts and follow your great work. So again, thank you. And we're really glad that you were with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everyone for your great questions. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.